could see on the map, the Find My app, that the AirTag had actually dropped off in the street not far from my house. And I just felt really creeped out.
Apple says it protects your privacy, not as a feature, as a promise. In a digital world built on tracking and surveillance, Apple presents itself as the company that stands apart. But what does protection actually look like when one company controls the device in your hand, the software inside it, and the rules that decide what you're allowed to install? For millions of users, Apple feels safe, predictable. Its systems work quietly in the background, rarely asking questions, rarely showing their limits. Over time, that reliability becomes trust. But is trust earned through transparency or through habit? Imagine if you discovered your device wasn't just serving you, but also tracking you. Would you still feel comfortable using it?
Right, Chris, she got a notification to her phone as she was pulling out of a grocery store parking lot right here at Edgewater with her toddler, and she'd been driving about 35 minutes before she realized it was still tracking her location.
Apple is not just a tech company. It is a gatekeeper. Every app, every update, every transaction passes through systems it designs and enforces. This control is rarely described as power. It's described as security, as protection. But when protection removes choice, what is left? And when safety depends on obedience to a single system, who benefits most? This story is not about what Apple says it protects. It's about what that protection costs, and whether anyone still knows where the line between safety and control really is. Welcome to Off the Record. A message is typed late at night. It's careful, personal. It sits on the screen for a moment, then disappears, deleted before it's ever sent. Nothing about that moment feels exposed. There's no hesitation, no second thought. This is an iPhone. Some things are assumed to stay private. Some moments are believed to end when you decide they should. That certainty isn't learned, it's absorbed. Only after that comfort is established does the language arrive. Privacy. Not as a setting, but as an identity.
At Apple, we believe privacy is a fundamental human right, so we build it into our products from the beginning of the design process. Privacy matters now more than ever.
For most users, that framing works. The system runs smoothly. The edges are rarely visible. And when a system feels this stable, trust doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like part of the environment, like the air in the room. But that ease carries a quiet cost. When trust is automatic, it's never tested. Confidence settles in before understanding ever arrives. So when something small interrupts that certainty, not a failure, just a realization, the response isn't outrage. It's disorientation. Not, is Apple misleading me? But, why did I assume this space was different? Nothing has collapsed. The promise hasn't disappeared. Yet something subtle has shifted. Trust is still there, but it's no longer invisible. And once trust becomes something you can see, even faintly, it stops being background noise. It becomes a question. Siri doesn't feel like software. You just speak. A question, a reminder, a half-formed thought said out loud and forgotten seconds later. That ease matters. Voice is the most intimate way we interact with machines. It happens in private spaces, bedrooms, cars, kitchens, places where no one expects to be overheard. And because nothing interrupts the exchange, nothing invites doubt. No forms, no confirmations, no friction. For years, that effortlessness shaped an assumption. If you don't feel watched, you don't feel the need to look. Privacy here wasn't something users examined. It was something they inherited. Then, quietly, that assumption was interrupted.
This morning, Apple admitting that its workers can listen to what you say to Siri on your phone, watch, or iPad, even in your car. This comes after an anonymous whistleblower reportedly told The Guardian newspaper.
In 2019, it emerged that short Siri recordings were sometimes reviewed by human contractors to improve accuracy. Apple confirmed the practice. The recordings were described as anonymous, used for quality control. What unsettled people wasn't the explanation. It was the realization. Just the sudden awareness that fragments of ordinary life, misfires, background conversations, moments never meant as commands, may have been heard by someone else. Strangers, briefly present in spaces that had felt closed. This wasn't a scandal in the usual sense. Nothing illegal was uncovered. But something quieter happened. A line people didn't know existed became visible. Privacy stopped being something you assumed was there. It became something you had to think about. Apple responded.
Apple is apologizing and promising to make changes after it revealed that contractors listened to audio recordings of customers using Siri.
The review program was paused. Later, it returned as opt-in. Users were given more control. From a policy standpoint, the issue was addressed, yet the shift lingered. Because the system still worked exactly as before. Siri still responded. The convenience remained. What changed was the feeling beneath it. Speaking no longer felt entirely frictionless. A pause appeared where none had existed. Nothing was broken, but something had been learned. And once privacy becomes something you have to remember to trust, it can no longer be effortless. The system remains intact. The promise remains in place. But the innocence of not having to think about it at all doesn't fully come back. The App Store feels calm. Nothing rushes you. Apps install cleanly. Updates arrive on their own. Payments happen without pause or uncertainty. For most people, the smoothness is the point. The system feels safe, predictable. There are no pop-ups asking where software came from. No warnings about risk. Everything sits behind a single doorway. Reviewed, approved, arranged. Safety isn't something you activate. It's the default state. Over time, that predictability becomes reassurance. When nothing unexpected ever happens, you stop imagining alternatives. The structure fades into the background. What remains is comfort. Then, slowly, the shape of that comfort becomes clearer. On iOS, there is only one way in. Apps arrive through Apple's system. Payments pass through Apple's platform. The rules are fixed. The percentages are set. Not as suggestions, but as conditions.
Yeah, thankfully for us now, it is virtually resolved in the sense that we have gotten a definitive approval to be in the App Store without paying Apple 30% of our revenues through their payment system.
There is no second path to compare against. No parallel store to choose instead. No negotiation built into the experience. This doesn't feel like a restriction. It feels complete. Leaving is possible, but it comes with friction. Apps don't transfer cleanly. Purchases don't follow. The cost isn't punishment. It's loss. Enough to make staying feel easier than questioning why there was never another choice. Take the story of Basecamp, a small app developer that launched the Hey Email application. Initially thrilled with the exposure on the App Store, they soon encountered significant challenges. When they wanted to introduce a subscription model, Apple resisted, insisting on a 30% commission for every subscription sold. This high fee and the strict guidelines left Basecamp feeling trapped, as their options for monetization were severely limited. They found themselves dependent on a system that was meant to empower them, yet constrained their ability to innovate and adapt. This is how control operates here. not through force, but through absence. There is no visible barrier, because there is no alternative space to push against. Safety doesn't feel imposed. It feels comprehensive. And when protection depends on there being no exit, safety and captivity begin to look uncomfortably similar. Apple describes its approach to artificial intelligence as careful, data minimized, processing kept close to the device, privacy preserved by design. The language is familiar, steady, reassuring. But this moment isn't defined by features. It's defined by timing. Across the technology industry, artificial intelligence is being built faster than the rules meant to govern it. And learning requires material, text, images, voices, patterns, drawn from the world before anyone fully agrees on where the boundaries should be. Consider the case of Sarah Anderson, Kelly McKernan, and Carla Ortiz. These visual artists discovered that their unique styles, developed over decades of work, were being perfectly mimicked by AI generators. Their art had been scraped into training datasets without their consent, credit, or a single cent of compensation. For them, this isn't a technical evolution. It's a direct threat to their livelihood. When an AI can produce an original piece in the style of Sarah Anderson in seconds, the human artist finds themselves competing against a ghost of their own creation. But focusing only on the dispute misses the larger point. What matters here is precedent.
All of our work has been used to train the, models, the data sets that these, generative AI models use. Your work is kind of like you. It feels like a weird identity theft almost.
When systems are built before limits are clearly defined, the builders don't just comply with future rules, they shape what those rules will eventually respond to. Apple has said its models rely on licensed data, publicly available material, and privacy-preserving techniques. It has also declined to fully detail its training datasets, citing security and intellectual property concerns. That position is defensible. It is also powerful, because infrastructure has momentum. Once systems work, once they scale, once they integrate into everyday use, they become difficult to unwind. Norms form around what already exists. Oversight arrives later, adapting to what has already been built. This is how influence operates. Not by breaking rules, but by arriving early. By setting the conditions under which questions will later be asked. So the issue isn't whether Apple will follow the law, it's who gets to decide what the law needs to address in the first place. Apple's systems work. They work reliably, quietly, almost invisibly. That consistency is the achievement. It's also the tension. When technology functions this smoothly, it stops asking anything of the user. In theory, there is always a choice. Other devices, other platforms, other paths. But choice doesn't live in theory. It lives in practice. And in practice, leaving comes with loss of familiarity, of continuity, of access. Not punishment, just enough friction to make staying feel easier than starting over. Consider the real-world journey of developer Marcus Oberlehner, who documented his escape from Apple to regain digital sovereignty. Marcus didn't just switch a phone. He had to manually migrate thousands of files trapped in proprietary silos. He discovered that leaving meant losing the Find My network that protected his devices, and the seamless airdrop flow that defined his work. His conclusion wasn't one of triumph, but of exhaustion. The system is designed to make the exit so tedious that most users simply give up and stay. This is where trust changes shape. It no longer feels like something you actively grant. It becomes something you inherit by remaining. Participation turns into default. Consent fades into routine. The ecosystem doesn't demand loyalty. It doesn't need to. It offers comfort, stability, and a sense of completion that makes alternatives feel unfinished by comparison. The issue is no longer whether Apple can be trusted. It's what trust even means when walking away no longer feels like a real option. No answer arrives. No resolution follows. The system remains seamless, functional, and already in place. Before the story ends, ask yourself, when was the last time trust felt like a decision? Leave your thoughts in the comments.